in the bond beyond blood. Rachel and Ethan's love story is one of redemption, resilience, and the unbreakable ties of family. From Rachel's betrayal and heartbreak in her youth to their unexpected reunion years later, their journey is tested by doubt, misunderstandings, and the high-risk birth of their twin daughters, Ellie and Nora, the twins, born with contrasting appearances yet an undeniable bond, become the heart of their family's strength. Through life-threatening challenges, emotional growth, and the power of forgiveness, Rachel and Ethan build a life filled with love, proving that family is more than blood. It's about the connections we fight for every day. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Did Rachel and Ethan's journey resonate with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to DG's Story for more inspiring tales that touch the heart and celebrate life's extraordinary moments. Rachel Carter leaned against the creaking old oak tree in her backyard, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her notebook. The early summer sun warmed her skin, but the familiar anxiety twisted in her chest. Writing poetry had always been her escape, her sanctuary, but reading it aloud? That was a different story. Her English teacher, Mrs. Hollis, had insisted Rachel perform her poem at the school's end-of-year showcase. "Your words have power, Rachel," she had said. Rachel wasn't so sure. Inside the packed auditorium, Rachel sat clutching her notebook, trying to steady her breathing. Her classmates bustled around, their laughter and chatter filling the space. She felt invisible, and she liked it that way. But her moment of invisibility shattered when a boy with sandy blonde hair and a confident stride strolled in. Ethan Miller. Rachel had heard the whispers. Ethan was new, transferring mid-year, and he had quickly become the center of attention. His effortless charm and boyish grin made him popular with everyone, teachers, classmates, and especially the girls. Rachel watched as he waved to a group of students who called his name, her heart sinking when he glanced her way. He caught her staring. Rachel quickly looked away, her face burning. To her horror, Ethan walked toward her. "You're Rachel, right?" he asked, his voice casual yet warm. Rachel nodded, unsure how to respond. "I heard you're reading a poem tonight. That's cool," he said, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. Rachel fumbled for words. "It's just something I wrote," she muttered, looking down at her notebook. "Well, I'm looking forward to it," Ethan said, flashing a grin before walking off. Rachel stared after him, her mind reeling. Why had he even bothered talking to her when it was her turn to take the stage? Rachel's hands trembled as she clutched the microphone. She could barely see the audience through the bright lights, but she knew they were there watching, judging. Her voice quavered as she began. "In the quiet of the night, I find my solace." As she read, something shifted. The words she had written, the emotions she had poured onto the page, started to flow. Her voice steadied, and she forgot about the crowd. When she finished, the applause was polite, but Rachel didn't care. She had done it. Backstage, as she gathered her things, Ethan appeared again. "That was amazing," he said. "You've got a real gift." Rachel blinked at him, unsure if he was mocking her. "Thanks," she said cautiously. "I mean it," Ethan insisted. "I'd like to read more of your stuff sometime." Rachel didn't know what to say. Nobody had ever shown interest in her poetry before. Before she could respond, Ethan's friends called him over, and he left with a wave. As Rachel walked home that evening, she felt an unfamiliar flutter of hope. Maybe things were changing. The next day at school, Rachel overhears Ethan's friends laughing about a bet. One of them says, "Ethan's got this in the bag." Rachel won't know what hit her. Rachel's heart pounded as she pressed herself against the cold locker, trying to make sense of what she had just overheard. "Ethan's got this in the bag." Rachel won't know what hit her. One of the boys laughed, his voice echoing in the hallway. "Yeah, $5 says he gets her to fall for him by Friday." Another voice chimed in, Rachel gripped the edges of her notebook tightly, her knuckles turning white. A cold wave of humiliation washed over her as the realization sank in: Ethan's kindness, his interest in her poetry. All of it had been part of some stupid bet. That evening, Rachel sat under the old oak tree in her backyard, her journal open but untouched. The words she wanted to write wouldn't come. Her mind was a storm of anger, confusion, and shame. "Hey!" A voice startled her. She turned to see Lucas Harper, her quiet neighbor, leaning over the fence. Lucas was the same age as Rachel but couldn't have been more different from Ethan. With his messy brown hair and oversized glasses, he had a reserved presence that made him easy to overlook. Yet, he had always been there, watching from the sidelines, a quiet observer of her world. "You look like you're ready to punch a hole in something," Lucas said, his tone light but filled with genuine concern. Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "You could say that. Want to talk about it?" he asked, climbing over the fence and sitting cross-legged on the grass beside her. For reasons she couldn't explain, Rachel found herself spilling everything: the poetry showcase, Ethan's compliments, and the cruel bet. Lucas listened silently, his green eyes thoughtful. "People can be jerks," he said simply when she finished. "But if you let them define how you see yourself, they win." Rachel stared at him, surprised by the wisdom in his words. "It's not that simple. It never is," Lucas replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "But for what it's worth, I've read your poetry before. You're really good. Don't let some idiot take that away from you." Rachel felt a flicker of warmth in her chest, a tiny crack of light breaking through the darkness. "Thanks," she murmured. Over the next few days, Rachel avoided Ethan at school. She kept her head down, focusing on her classes and finding solace in her growing friendship with Lucas. He had a quiet way of making her feel seen without drawing attention to it. One afternoon, as they sat under the oak tree, Lucas opened up about his own struggles. "I lost my sister 2 years ago," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "She was my best friend. Since then, I felt adrift." Rachel placed a hand on his, the weight of his confession settling between them. "I'm sorry, Lucas. That must have been so hard." "It still is," he admitted. "But talking to you, it helps." Their bond deepened, built on shared pain and an unspoken understanding. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt like she had someone she could truly trust. Meanwhile, Ethan wasn't ready to give up. He left handwritten notes in Rachel's locker, apologizing for the bet and insisting it hadn't meant anything to him. "Rachel, I messed up. I'm sorry. Can we talk?" She ignored them all. But one day, Ethan caught her after class. "Rachel, please," he said, stepping in her path. "What do you want, Ethan?" She snapped, her voice sharp with anger. "To explain," he said, his blue eyes pleading. "The bet was stupid. I never should have agreed to it. But when I got to know you, I realized you're amazing. The bet stopped mattering a long time ago." Rachel crossed her arms, her heart warring with her head. "How do I know this isn't just another game to you?" "You don't," Ethan admitted, "but I'm willing to prove it, however long it takes." Rachel hesitated, her walls still firmly in place. "I'll think about it," she said curtly before walking away. That evening, Lucas noticed Rachel seemed distracted. "You okay?" he asked as they worked on a school project together. Rachel hesitated. "Ethan wants to talk. He says he's sorry." Lucas's expression darkened. "And you believe him?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted. Lucas's jaw tightened, a rare flash of emotion crossing his face. "Be careful, Rachel. Some people don't deserve second chances." Years passed, and life carried Rachel and Ethan in separate directions. Rachel, now 25, had built a life she was proud of in Chicago, working as a youth counselor at a community center. She spent her days helping teenagers find their voices, much like she had once found hers through poetry. But some nights, when the city quieted, memories of her teenage years resurfaced. She often thought about Ethan, Lucas, and the lessons she had learned from both of them. Lucas had been her anchor during a time of turmoil, but they had drifted apart when she left for college. As for Ethan, she had buried their connection deep, unsure if she had truly forgiven him. One evening, as Rachel scrolled through her phone after a long day, a notification appeared. Friend request, Ethan Miller. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Accepting would open a door she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through, but curiosity, and perhaps a touch of nostalgia, won out. Within minutes, a message popped up. Rachel, it's been a long time. I've thought about reaching out so many times. I hope you're doing well. Could we catch up? Rachel stared at the screen, her emotions a swirl of excitement and caution. After a moment, she typed a reply. It has been a long time. I'm doing well, thanks. How about you? A week later, Rachel found herself sitting at a cozy cafe downtown, nervously stirring her tea. The door jingled, and there he was, Ethan Miller, older but still possessing the boyish charm she remembered. Rachel, he said, his face lighting up with a smile as he approached her table. Ethan, she replied, standing to greet him. They sat across from each other, exchanging polite pleasantries before diving into the deeper questions. Ethan told her about his life since high school, how his family had moved to Denver, how he had struggled to find his footing in college, and how he eventually pursued a career in architecture. And you? He asked, leaning forward. What's life been like for you? Rachel hesitated, unsure how much to share, but as she described her work, her passion for helping others, and the quiet pride she took in her independence, Ethan listened intently. You've done amazing things, he said sincerely. I always knew you would. Rachel felt a flicker of warmth at his words, but she kept her guard up. Why did you reach out, Ethan? He hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. Because I've never stopped thinking about you. Rachel's breath caught. I made so many mistakes back then, Ethan continued, but getting to know you, even for a short time, changed me. I've carried that with me all these years. And now, I wanted to see if there was still something between us. Rachel's thoughts spiraled. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, but so were the memories of betrayal. Later that night, Rachel sat in her apartment, staring at the poem she had written about Ethan years ago. It was tucked between the pages of her old journal, the words raw and full of the emotions she had buried. You saw me when no one else did, but you broke what you saw, and I'm still picking up the pieces. The pain lingered, but so did the memory of the way he had looked at her that evening, hopeful, vulnerable, real. The next day, Rachel messaged Ethan, let's take this slow. I'm not promising anything, but I'm willing to see where this goes. Their reunion begins to stir long-forgotten emotions. But Rachel's peace is disrupted when Lucas unexpectedly shows up at her community center. I heard you're back in touch with Ethan, he says, his tone unreadable. Do you think that's a good idea? Rachel stood frozen in the doorway of her office at the community center, staring at Lucas. She hadn't seen him in years. Yet here he was, older but unmistakably the same Lucas, calm, steady, with those thoughtful green eyes that seemed to see straight through her. I didn't know you were back in town, Rachel said, stepping aside to let him in. I moved back last year, Lucas replied, his voice soft. I heard about your work here. It's good to see you again. Rachel. She smiled awkwardly, unsure of what to say. Lucas had been her rock once, but life had pulled them in different directions. What brings you here? Lucas hesitated before answering. I ran into Ethan. He mentioned you two were talking again. Rachel stiffened, a mix of guilt and frustration bubbling inside her. And I wanted to make sure you're okay, Lucas said simply. I know how much he hurt you back then. Rachel crossed her arms, feeling the weight of his concern. People change. Lucas, he seems different now. Lucas sighed. his gaze unwavering. Maybe, but just be careful. Okay. You deserve someone who's going to put you first. Always. Rachel didn't respond. She didn't want to argue, but Lucas's words lingered long after he left. Over the next few months, Rachel and Ethan's relationship slowly blossomed. Ethan made it clear he was serious this time, showing up for her in ways he never had before, listening, supporting, and making an effort to understand her world. One crisp autumn evening, they sat on the rooftop of Ethan's apartment building, overlooking the city lights. "I've missed this," Ethan said, leaning back against the railing. "Missed what?" Rachel asked, curious. "Being with you," he said, his voice tinged with both nostalgia and longing. "You've always been different, Rachel. You see the world in a way no one else does." Rachel felt her heart soften. "I've missed you too," she admitted quietly. As the months went by, they grew closer, sharing their dreams and fears. But their newfound happiness was soon tested by an unexpected revelation. One morning, Rachel sat on the edge of her bathtub, staring at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. 2 pink lines stared back at her. Her mind raced. She and Ethan had been careful, or so she thought. Now, everything was about to change. That evening, she met Ethan for dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant. As they sat across from each other, she reached for his hand. "I need to tell you something," Rachel began, her voice shaking. Ethan leaned forward, concern etched on his face. "What's wrong?" "I'm pregnant," she blurted out. Ethan's eyes widened, and for a moment, Rachel couldn't read his expression. Then, to her surprise, a slow smile spread across his face. "We're going to be parents?" Rachel nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Ethan reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Rachel, this is amazing. Scary, sure, but amazing." Rachel exhaled, relief washing over her. But as the reality of their situation sank in, so did the challenges ahead. At Rachel's first ultrasound appointment, the doctor gave them news that sent a ripple of both excitement and fear through the room. "You're having twins," the doctor announced. Smiling, Rachel gasped, looking at the screen in disbelief. Ethan's jaw dropped, and then he grinned. "Twins? That's incredible." But the doctor's expression grew serious. "There's something you should know. Your twins are monochorionic monoamniotic. They share a single amniotic sac, which is rare and comes with risks. We'll need to monitor you very closely." Rachel's heart sank. "What kind of risks?" The doctor explained the dangers of cord entanglement and the need for possible early delivery. "It's a high-risk pregnancy, but with proper care. We'll do everything we can to ensure the best outcome." The drive home was quiet. Rachel stared out the window, her mind swirling with worry. "Talk to me," Ethan said gently, reaching for her hand. "I'm scared," Rachel admitted. "What if something goes wrong? What if we lose them?" Ethan pulled the car over and turned to her, his expression firm yet tender. "Rachel, we'll face this together, no matter what happens. You're not alone." As Rachel and Ethan prepared for the challenges of her pregnancy, another storm brewed on the horizon. Lucas called her one evening, his voice hesitant. "Rachel, I've been thinking, what if you're making a mistake with Ethan?" Rachel stared at her phone, Lucas's words ringing in her ears. She had been expecting concern from him, but not this level of doubt. "Lucas," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "Ethan has been here for me through everything. He's not the same person he was back then." "I hope you're right," Lucas replied, his tone heavy with hesitation. "I just don't want to see you get hurt again." "Thanks for caring," Rachel said quietly before ending the call. As Rachel set her phone down, she felt the weight of the conversation settling on her chest. Deep down, she trusted Ethan, but the risks of her pregnancy and Lucas's lingering doubts gnawed at her, creating an unease she couldn't ignore. The following weeks tested Rachel and Ethan in ways they had never imagined. As Rachel entered her second trimester, her doctor put her on partial bed rest to minimize complications. The news hit hard. Rachel had to take a leave of absence from her work at the community center, a place that had become her second home. "I feel useless," Rachel admitted one evening as she lay on the couch, her hands resting on her growing belly. "You're not useless," Ethan said, kneeling beside her. "You're doing the most important job in the world, keeping our babies safe." Rachel wanted to believe him, but the reality of her situation was overwhelming. With her income gone, Ethan had to take on extra hours at his job. While she appreciated his dedication, his absence left her feeling increasingly isolated. One afternoon, Rachel felt a sharp pain ripple through her abdomen. Panic surged through her as she called Ethan, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong. I need to go to the hospital." Ethan rushed home, his face pale as he helped her into the car. The ride to the hospital was tense, both of them silent except for Rachel's ragged breaths. At the hospital, doctors ran a series of tests and determined that one of the twins' umbilical cords had become slightly compressed, reducing blood flow. "We've stabilized the situation," the doctor reassured them, "but this underscores the need for close monitoring. Rachel, we may need to admit you for extended observation as you approach your third trimester." Rachel nodded numbly, clutching Ethan's hand. The strain began to show in their relationship. Ethan was exhausted from balancing work and hospital visits, while Rachel struggled with feelings of helplessness. One night, as they sat in the hospital room, Ethan let out a frustrated sigh. "I just don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Rachel looked at him, hurt. "Do you think I'm not doing enough?" "No," Ethan said quickly, his tone softening. "That's not what I meant. I feel like I'm failing you. I can't be everywhere at once." Rachel's expression softened. "You're not failing me, Ethan, but we can't do this alone. Maybe we should ask for help." Ethan hesitated, his pride warring with his exhaustion. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. Let's talk to our families." Rachel's mom, Emily, stepped in immediately, taking over household duties and bringing meals to the hospital. Ethan's mother, who had been skeptical of Rachel, surprised them by offering financial support. "I may not have been fair to you," Ethan's mom admitted to Rachel during one visit, "but I see how much you love my son and how hard you're fighting for those babies. You've earned my respect." Rachel blinked back tears. "Thank you. That means a lot." 28 weeks. During a routine checkup, the doctor delivered grim news. Twin B's umbilical cord had formed a knot, a dangerous condition that could cut off blood flow entirely. "We need to deliver them early," the doctor said. "It's risky, but waiting any longer could be life-threatening." Rachel and Ethan exchanged a terrified glance. "How soon?" Ethan asked. "Tomorrow morning," the doctor replied. That night, Rachel lay awake in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Ethan sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. "What if something happens to them?" she whispered. Ethan leaned close, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together. I promise." The next morning, as Rachel was wheeled into the operating room, she squeezed Ethan's hand one last time. "I love you," she said, her voice trembling. "I love you too," Ethan replied, his eyes glistening. "You've got this, Rachel." So do they. The sterile brightness of the operating room enveloped Rachel as she lay on the table, her heart pounding in her chest. Monitors beeped steadily, and the sound of the surgical team preparing their instruments filled the air. Ethan stood near her head, his hand gripping hers tightly. "You're doing great," he whispered, though the strain in his voice betrayed his own fear. The anesthesiologist leaned over. "Ready, Rachel? You're going to feel some pressure, but we're here every step of the way." Rachel nodded, her throat dry. The procedure began, and though Rachel couldn't feel pain, the weight of what was happening pressed down on her. She stared up at Ethan, finding comfort in the way his green eyes never wavered from hers. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. "We've got twin A," the surgeon announced suddenly. A sharp, piercing cry filled the room. Rachel exhaled in relief as the first baby was lifted into view. A tiny, pink-skinned girl with a tuft of blonde hair. "She looks like you," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's beautiful," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. The nurse quickly whisked the baby away to check her vitals. But the relief was short-lived. "Twin B's cord is knotted tightly," the surgeon said, her tone urgent. "We need to move fast." Rachel's grip on Ethan's hand tightened as the tension in the room grew. "Stay with me, Rachel," Ethan murmured, leaning close. "You're the strongest person I know." The seconds dragged as the medical team worked with precision. Finally, another cry broke through the tension, softer but unmistakable. "Here's Twin B," the surgeon said, holding up a tiny baby with deep brown skin and dark curls. Rachel's heart swelled. "She's perfect," she whispered, her voice trembling. But as the nurse took the baby to the warming station, her expression grew serious. "She's having trouble breathing. Let's get her to the NICU." Rachel's chest tightened. "What's happening?" The doctor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's not uncommon for premature babies to need respiratory support. We'll do everything we can." Ethan's face was pale, but he nodded. "You hear that? She's in good hands," he said, though his hand trembled in hers. As the team worked to stabilize Rachel after the delivery, a sudden wave of dizziness overcame her. She gasped, her vision blurring, blood pressures dropping. A nurse called out. "What's happening?" Ethan demanded, panic lacing his voice. "She's hemorrhaging," the surgeon said, her tone calm but firm. "We need to stop the bleeding." Ethan's world tilted as the room erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses and doctors moved swiftly, their voices overlapping. He felt utterly helpless, watching as Rachel's face grew pale. Leaning close, he pressed his forehead to hers. "Stay with me, Rachel," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't do this without you." Through the haze of pain and fear, Rachel managed to whisper back, "I'm not going anywhere." Hours later, Rachel woke up in the recovery room, her body weak but alive. The first thing she saw was Ethan sitting beside her, his head bowed as if in prayer. "Ethan," she croaked, her voice barely audible. His head shot up, his eyes wide with relief. "Rachel," he breathed, leaning closer. "You're okay. You scared me so much." Rachel managed a faint smile. "The babies, are they okay?" Ethan pulled out his phone, showing her a photo. "Look," he said, his voice filled with awe. On the screen was an image of the two babies in the NICU, lying side by side. Twin A, fair-skinned and blonde, rested peacefully. Twin B, with her darker complexion and curly hair, lay beside her, her tiny hand clutching her sister's. "They're holding hands," Rachel whispered, tears filling her eyes. "They've been doing it since the nurses put them together," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "It's like they already know they need each other." The next day, Rachel was strong enough to visit the NICU. As she and Ethan stood over the incubators, their hearts swelled with a mix of awe and love. "You two are fighters," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling as she placed her hand gently on the incubator glass. Twin A's vitals were strong, but Twin B remained on a ventilator, her small body connected to a web of tubes and monitors. "She's so tiny," Rachel said, tears streaming down her face. "She's strong, like her mom," Ethan said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, Rachel allowed herself to feel a sliver of hope. As Rachel and Ethan prepared to leave the NICU, the doctor approached them with a serious expression. "Twin B is stable for now, but the next 48 hours will be critical. We'll need to monitor her closely." Rachel's knees felt weak as Ethan steadied her. "We've come this far," he whispered. "We'll get through this too." The NICU was a world of quiet hums and beeping monitors. Rachel sat beside Twin B's incubator, her fingers resting gently on the clear plastic. The tiny baby inside, with her dark curls and fragile frame, seemed impossibly small. "You're so strong," Rachel whispered, "You've already fought so hard to be here. I need you to keep fighting. Sweetheart." Ethan stood behind Rachel, his hand resting on her shoulder. "She's going to make it," he said softly, as much to reassure himself as her. Rachel turned to look at him, her eyes filled with both hope and fear. "How do you know?" Ethan crouched beside her, his green eyes steady. "Because she's got your strength, and she's got her sister right there with her." He pointed to the neighboring incubator where twin A lay, her fair skin rosy and her tiny body moving slightly in her sleep. Even now, twin A's hand rested against the wall of her incubator, as if reaching for her sister. On the second night after the delivery, a nurse gently shook Rachel awake in the NICU. "Mrs. Carter," the nurse said, her voice tinged with excitement. "You need to see this." Rachel rubbed her eyes and sat up, her heart racing as she followed the nurse to twin B's incubator. "She's breathing on her own," the nurse said, her smile wide. "We've removed the ventilator." Tears filled Rachel's eyes as she saw her daughter's tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Twin B's little hand moved in the air as if reaching for something. "She's doing it," Rachel whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan, who had just returned from a brief rest, hurried into the room when Rachel told him the news. He let out a shaky laugh and wrapped her in a tight embrace. "Our little fighter," he murmured. The next morning, the doctors gave Rachel permission to hold twin B for the first time. Rachel sat in a chair, her body still weak but trembling with anticipation. The nurse gently placed the baby in her arms, arranging the wires and tubes carefully. As soon as twin B settled against Rachel's chest, her tiny hand curled into a fist and pressed against Rachel's skin. Rachel let out a soft sob. "She's perfect," she whispered. Ethan stood beside her, his own eyes wet with tears. "You're both perfect," he said, pressing a kiss to Rachel's temple. Twin A, now stable and thriving, was also brought to Rachel later that day, holding both of her daughters for the first time. Rachel felt a wave of love so profound it left her breathless. "You two are going to have the most amazing bond," she said, looking from one baby to the other. "You're so different, but you belong together." After weeks of monitoring, the doctors finally declared both twins healthy enough to go home. The news felt like a victory after all they had endured. As they prepared to leave the hospital, the nurses and doctors who had cared for the twins gathered to say goodbye. "You've been through so much," one nurse said, "but seeing your family now, it's truly inspiring." Rachel smiled, cradling twin B while Ethan held twin A in his arms. "Thank you for everything," she said. The car ride home was surreal. Rachel and Ethan sat in the back seat with the twins, their tiny car seats buckled securely. "They're so quiet," Ethan whispered, glancing down at twin A, who was fast asleep. Rachel chuckled softly. "Give them a few weeks. We'll be wishing for this quiet." Back home, the nursery, painted in soft shades of yellow and green, was finally filled with life. Rachel placed twin B in her crib, then leaned over to adjust twin A's blanket. For a moment, she simply stood there, watching them sleep. "They're miracles," she said quietly. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "So are you," he said. Rachel smiled, leaning into him. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace, just as Rachel began to settle into the rhythm of motherhood. A phone call shattered the quiet. It was Lucas. "Rachel," he said, his voice hesitant. "I've been thinking about you. Can we meet? I need to tell you something." Rachel stared at her phone, Lucas's voice still echoing in her mind. She hadn't spoken to him since the twins were born, and the suddenness of his call unsettled her. "What is it, Lucas?" she asked, her voice wary. "I just need a chance to talk," Lucas said. "It's important." Rachel hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no, to protect the fragile peace she had built with Ethan and the twins. But another part of her, the part that remembered Lucas's quiet support during her darkest moments, couldn't ignore him. "Okay," she finally said. "Tomorrow, at the park by the lake." The next day, Rachel bundled up the twins and handed them to Ethan. "I'll be back soon," she said, kissing his cheek. "You okay?" Ethan asked, sensing her unease. "Yeah," Rachel said, offering a faint smile. "I just need to take care of something." Ethan nodded, though his brow furrowed with concern. At the park, Rachel spotted Lucas sitting on a bench overlooking the water. He stood as she approached, his expression uncertain. "Thanks for coming," Lucas said. "Let's get to it," Rachel replied, crossing her arms. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking about us, about everything we've been through." "Lucas, I don't know if—" "Just hear me out," he interrupted gently. "I let you go once because I thought it was what you needed. But now, seeing you with Ethan, I can't help but wonder if I made the wrong choice." Rachel blinked, caught off guard. "Lucas, that's not fair. I'm with Ethan now. We have a family." "I know," Lucas said, his voice filled with regret. "But I had to tell you how I feel. I'll regret it forever if I don't." Rachel shook her head, her emotions swirling. "Lucas, care about you. I always have. But Ethan, he's the one I want to build my life with." Lucas nodded, though the pain in his eyes was clear. "I needed to hear that," he said softly. "Thank you for being honest." As Rachel turned to leave, Lucas called out, "For what it's worth, I'm happy for you. Rachel, you deserve this." Rachel smiled faintly. "Thank you, Lucas. I hope you find your happiness too." When Rachel returned home, Ethan was sitting on the floor with the twins, making funny faces that had them giggling. "You're back," he said, looking up with a smile. "Yeah," Rachel said, her heart swelling as she watched him with their daughters. Ethan stood, sensing something had shifted. "Everything okay?" Rachel nodded, wrapping her arms around him. "It is now." That night, after the twins were asleep, Rachel sat at the kitchen table with her notebook. The soft hum of the baby monitor filled the silence as she began to write. "To Ellie and Nora," she wrote, addressing her daughters by name. "You came into this world as miracles, teaching me lessons about strength, love, and resilience. You've shown me that family isn't about perfection. It's about the moments we fight for and the people we hold close." Rachel paused, glancing at the charm bracelet on her wrist. Each charm represented a part of her journey: a tree for the oak in her backyard, a book for her love of poetry, and a globe for the paths that had led her to this moment. She continued writing, pouring her heart into the letter. "Life won't always be easy. There will be doubts, challenges, and heartbreak. But if there's one thing I hope you always remember, it's this: you are deeply loved, exactly as you are. And together, we can face anything." The next weekend, the family gathered under the oak tree in their backyard. Ethan set up a camera to capture the moment as Rachel held Ellie and Nora in her arms. The twins babbled and giggled, their bond unmistakable even at such a young age. "You think they'll ever understand how much we've been through?" Rachel asked softly. "They'll know," Ethan said, wrapping an arm around her. "Because we'll show them, every single day." As the camera's timer beeped, they smiled, capturing a snapshot of their imperfect but beautiful life. Years later, as Ellie and Nora grew into curious, spirited young girls, Rachel often told them the story of their birth. "You taught me that love comes in all forms," Rachel would say, "and that family is built on strength, forgiveness, and hope." The girls would listen intently, their hands clasped together in an unspoken bond. And in the quiet moments, Rachel would look at her daughters and feel a profound sense of gratitude. Their story wasn't just about survival, it was about love that transcended differences, hope that endured through hardship, and the strength to create a life filled with meaning. The story ends with the family sitting under the oak tree, the sun setting behind them. Rachel leans against Ethan, the charm bracelet still on her wrist, a symbol of the journey that brought them here. Through Rachel and Ethan's journey, we are reminded that love isn't perfect. It's messy, challenging, and sometimes painful, but it's also the most powerful force we have, capable of healing wounds, bridging differences, and creating miracles.